And tonight, as we come on the air here, there is an urgent manhunt for the suspected gunman. Authorities say a U.S. Army reservist.
Governor Janet Mills announced in her State of the State address that she's proposing mandated background checks.
And ask ourselves what changes are needed to fully protect the safety of Maine people.
The narrative that criminals will always get their hands on guns.
Prayers, of course, go out to our New England neighbors in Maine as they deal with this incredible tragedy.
Maine's arm control landscape. The state of Maine, long known for its hunting traditions and deep-rooted arm culture, has recently witnessed significant legislative shifts in favor of arm control measures. In the closing hours of this year's legislative session, the Democratic-controlled House and Senate passed a series of bills representing the most substantial policy changes regarding arms in Maine in decades. The attention has now turned to Governor Janet Mills, a moderate Democrat whose stance on several of these measures remains undisclosed. Among the key bills passed is one requiring background checks for private arms sales advertised online or in print. Additionally, lawmakers approve a ban on rapid firearm modifications such as bump stocks and the imposition of a 72-hour waiting period for arms sales. These measures represent a departure from Maine's historically pro-arms stance and signal a significant shift in the state's approach to arms regulation. For proponents of stronger arm laws, these legislative victories mark a turning point in Maine's political landscape. Representative Victoria Dudera, co-chair of the legislature's Armed Safety Caucus, views the successful passage of these bills as a critical step forward in addressing armed crime. Dudera notes a gradual change in attitudes among her colleagues, particularly in response to growing concerns about mass slayings and self-destruction rates, which account for nearly 90% of armed demises in Maine. The tragic events of recent years, including a quadruple homicide in Bowdoin and a mass slaying in Lewiston, have galvanized support for stricter arm regulations among lawmakers and the public alike.
In Maine, the scene of a horrific mass shooting here, at least 18 dead and at least 13 injured, several of them critically.
Gun legislation is top of mind for people and lawmakers here in Maine after 18 people were shot and killed in Lewiston.
And tonight, as we come on the air here, there is an urgent manhunt for the suspected gunman. Authorities say a U.S. Army reservist.
Prayers, of course, go out to our New England neighbors in Maine as they deal with this incredible tragedy.
The Lewiston shooting, in which 18 people lost their lives, serve as a stark reminder that Maine is not immune to the scourge of armed crime plaguing the nation. However, not all stakeholders view the legislative session's outcomes positively. David Trahan, Executive Director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, considers the results a mixed bag. While Trahan acknowledges the need for sensible arm policies, he expresses reservations about certain measures such as the 72-hour waiting period and the bump stock ban. Despite Trahan's concerns, he appreciates Governor Mills' inclusive approach to policy making, which allows input from various stakeholders. Trahan believes that the governor's collaborative approach fosters a more balanced legislative process. Nevertheless, Trahan attributes much of the recent legislative activity to external influences, particularly national advocacy groups like Everytown for Armed Safety, led by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Trahan suggests that such groups capitalize on tragedies to advance their policy agendas, shaping the arm control debate at the state level. Indeed, both pro-arm and arm control organizations were actively engaged in lobbying efforts during the legislative session. While the National Rifle Association or NRA maintained a visible presence at the State House, Everytown for Armed Safety mobilized its supporters to advocate for stricter firearm regulations. Olivia Lee, legal counsel for Everytown, views the recent legislative developments in Maine as a significant step forward in armed safety advocacy. Lee emphasizes the importance of shifting the conversation beyond mass slayings to include suicide prevention and mental health services. She sees promise in the broader focus of the debate and hopes it will drive momentum for future armed safety initiatives.
Strengthens background checks for private sales of guns and will make it a crime to sell a gun to someone who is prohibited from having a firearm.
Governor Janet Mills announced in her State of the State address that she's proposing mandated background checks.
Governor Janet Mills today signed sweeping legislation for improved gun safety and mental health after the Lewiston shooting.
Debates and controversies. The recent legislative session in Maine saw significant debate and close votes on several arm control bills, reflecting the state's complex relationship with arms. Among the measures passed was a proposal to implement a 72-hour waiting period for most arm purchases, a move that has sparked controversy and legal challenges from Second Amendment advocates. The passage of the 72-hour waiting period bill was achieved by a narrow margin, with votes in both chambers coming down to just one vote. Critics, including arm owners' rights advocates, have accused Democrats of using parliamentary maneuvers to secure this outcome, particularly by allowing absent Democrats to pair their votes in support of the bill with those who were opposed. Governor Janet Mills, a moderate Democrat, now faces the decision of whether to sign, veto, or allow the arm control bills to become law without her signature. Mills, a former attorney general and state lawmaker, has expressed conflicting feelings about the waiting period proposal but has allowed it to proceed without her explicit endorsement. She hopes that the same measure can prevent arm-related self-destructions while balancing the interest of responsible arm owners and Maine's outdoor sports economy. The 72-hour waiting period requirement has drawn sharp criticism from Second Amendment groups who have vowed to challenge it in court. These groups argue that such regulations infringe upon individuals' constitutional rights to arm ownership and purchasing. The debate over arm control in Maine reflects broader divisions and debates across the United States, where concerns about public safety, constitutional rights, and the impact on various industries intersect. In addition to the waiting period, other arm control measures were also passed during the legislative session. These include expanded background checks for private arms sales advertised online or in print, and a ban on rapid firearm modifications like bump stocks. These developments signal a significant shift in Maine's approach to arm policy, with Democrats championing more stringent regulations in response to growing concerns about armed crime and public safety.
Janet Mills is calling for change around gun laws.
Yeah, as the investigation presses on to figure out how a mass shooting like this could happen.
The research that we have done about why mass shootings happen that would point to Maine as being, a safe state.
And to ask ourselves what changes are needed to fully protect the safety of Maine people.
While supporters of stronger armed laws views these victories as a step forward in addressing armed crime, opponents argue that such measures infringe upon individual liberties and fail to address underlying issues. The debate surrounding arm control legislation in Maine underscores the complex and deeply entrenched views on arms within the state, where considerations of tradition, culture, and public safety and constitutional rights intersect. Moving forward, the implementation and impact of these arm control measures will continue to be closely monitored and debated by lawmakers, advocates, and the public. As Maine navigates its evolving stance on arm policy, finding a balance between protecting public safety and respecting individual rights will remain a central challenge for policymakers and stakeholders alike. Governor Mills faces backlash. Democratic legislators pushed the proposal through the House and Senate, claiming it was a necessary response to the October 25 tragedy in which an Army reservist opened fire on a bar and bowling alley in Lewiston, slaying 13 people and injuring 18. The National Rifle Association blasted Mills for signing legislation that it argues will destroy Maine hunting tourism and prevent domestic misuse survivors from arming and protecting themselves. Instead of standing with law-abiding arm owners, domestic misuse survivors, hunters, and small businesses, Governor Mills has given way to policy demands of radical Portland progressives dead set on deteriorating your Record Amendment rights, the National Rifle Association said in a statement. According to the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, the 72-hour waiting period regulation will be challenged in court, with the group claiming that the restrictions violate the Constitution. The state's worst shooting in Lewiston sparked a controversial debate about stronger arm rules in the predominantly rural state, where owning an arm is common, and several Democratic officials have previously opposed such legislation. Republicans, on the other hand, argued that the limitations would have no effect on armed crime and would deprive legitimate arm owners of their rights. They accused Democrats of taking political advantage of the Lewiston atrocity. Mills also rejected a second proposal to expand background checks to encompass private arms sales on social media and other online platforms, as well as proposed ban on bump stocks, which increased the firing rate of semi-auto rifles. She said that the proposal's broad and ambiguous phrasing would create uncertainty for law enforcement and lawful arm owners. In her letter of opposition, Mills expressed concerns that the bill could inadvertently lead to a ban on a substantial number of arms used for hunting or target shooting by responsible arm owners in Maine. She emphasized that any legislation imposing such restrictions should be formulated in a thoughtful, inclusive, and transparent way, taking into account both the advocates for armed safety and those who are concerned about preserving lawful access to arms.
Janet Mills announced a series of gun legislation proposals that include strengthening the state's yellow flag law and boosting background checks.
Governor Janet Mills gets involved in talks to find any common ground when it comes to guns in Maine.
The narrative that criminals will always get their hands on guns.
At this time, we told you how the legislature was considering 8 bills having to do with gun restrictions, some to tighten them.
That's all for today, folks. See you next time.